go to each of you in turn, and you can introduce yourselves and speak a little about your area of expertise and what you'll be talking to us about today. And let's start on my immediate right with Wayne Pathan. Wayne.
Again, my name is Wayne Pathan. I'm a land use and zoning attorney and managing partner at Pathman Lewis. I'm currently the chairman of the City of Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce and also the chairman of the City of Miami Sea Level Rise Committee. I've been involved in sea level rise and its related issues for about 5 years now. I have spoken throughout the country and also traveled to the Netherlands and other parts of Europe to look into the issue of sea level rise and flooding and how it will affect South Florida. We have a very unique problem. As Quinn had mentioned, our geology is made up of limestone and muck, which allows water to travel from underneath. Most areas that you might be familiar with, where you see flooding like New Orleans, they deal with spillover water. They don't deal with rising water. We're going to have to deal with both. And that makes our community very unique. And around the world, we are considered ground zero for economic impact due to sea level rise. The City of Miami, through the committee that I chair, we are in the process of doing many things, one of which is mapping the entire City of Miami to determine where the areas that have to be addressed first, sort of like a triage approach, and implement, hopefully, solutions in the future to deal with that. One of the things that I also speak about through our committee and talk about something that you may not be familiar with, you probably have heard about sea level rise, and today was one of the king tide days where the streets were flooding in Miami Beach. But one of the things you'll see long before the water gets here on a daily basis is that insurance, banking, and taxation will change. As many of you know, your flood insurance you purchase through the National Flood Insurance Program. If I were a businessman and we were doing a deal, you wouldn't do business with me if I were representing the National Flood Insurance Program. It's currently $25 billion in the red and growing, and it only provides $250,000 worth of insurance for residences and $500,000 for commercial property. Why is that important? Because in the future, banks will probably stop giving 30-year mortgages, but also require borrowers to have excess flood insurance, which is an annualized insurance that you'll have to go out in the public and get on an annualized basis. So for example, if you have a $2 million home or property, let's say it's a home, and the bank says you have to have 30% coverage, you would have to have $600,000 worth of insurance. You can get $250,000 from the federal government, and now you have to buy the balance in the private sector. The federal government will be raising rates considerably in the next 10 or 12 years. Some of you may remember in 2012, Congress passed the Brigate Waters Act. That act basically did away with the current flood insurance program as we know it, and insurance skyrocketed 200 to 300%. Because there was an outcry from many of the coastal cities throughout the United States. In 2014, they created the Affordability Act. The Affordability Act basically is the 2012 Act in disguise, but it lowered the rates back to normal rates. But they are still climbing faster than they anticipated. Eventually, we will see increases of 100 to 200% potentially for flood insurance in low-lying areas in South Florida. To give you an example, all of Miami Beach is a special flood hazardous area. So those rates on all of Miami Beach will rise. I'm not a doom and gloomer. I believe that there are solutions. For example, on Brickell Avenue, some of you may be familiar with the 1450 building, the black glass colored building on the west side of Brickell Avenue. That building wasn't designed to be resilient for sea level rise, but it was designed to be green. But along the way, the designer, the architect, and the developer realized that by being green and doing the things that they did, they also made the building resilient. The pedestal of that building is higher than almost every building on Brickell. It has laminated glass. It has raised elevator banks and generators that will run the building for approximately 60 plus days. As a result of that type of development, the developer put in $15 to $20 million more than what was required under the current code. And understanding the code is also very important, but he's already getting a return on his energy costs of over $1 million a year. Plus, most of the major businesses, especially from the Northeast, have moved into that building and are paying higher rents because they want to be in a building that will survive a hurricane or a flood-related incident like having a 100-year rainstorm. It's important to understand building codes. The building codes eventually and zoning will have to change to adopt new strategy and technology to build better. Miami has gone through one of its greatest reurbanizations in the inner core, at evaluations never seen before, from South Brickell to 36th Street. So approximately 60 new buildings are either under construction, permitted, or will be built. Only 2 buildings, one that I just mentioned, the 1450 and the Perez Art Museum, are resilient for sea level rise. So that gives you a perspective of where the city is today and how we have built and created a new urban environment, but it's not adaptable to the future. Much has to be done. The committee that I chair with the City of Miami, we're starting to look into that. Miami-Dade County has a new resiliency officer. Jim Murley, City of Miami Beach has one, Susan Torrente, and the City of Miami will be announcing their Assistant City Manager, Resiliency Officer by the end of the month. Also, the 2 cities in the county recently received the Rockefeller Grant for 100 Resilient Cities, and that has really kick-started a real effort here in South Florida to really try to understand climate change, sea level rise, and the stresses and shocks that Quinn talked about, and how important that is to developing our community in the future. The Rockefeller Grant is not specifically for sea level rise, but it talks about sea level rise and addresses those issues. When I was at a workshop recently on behalf of the City of Miami with the Rockefeller Foundation, it was shocking. Talk about stresses and shocks, how many stresses and shocks there are in our community, and where will the funding come from? So something that will have to change in the future is that government can't afford to do this alone. Some of you are probably familiar with P3s, public-private partnerships. Where public-private partnerships are available, cities and counties are going to have to start looking at them. One of the things I also like to talk about is that South Florida, the state of Florida, has been very slow to react. The business community is really unengaged at this point. The business community probably won't get engaged until the issues related to sea level rise and flooding are refined, because if someone's planning to build a building, and you hear one study, Quinn pointed out to one that's 8 inches by 2050. The Army Corps of Engineers expects that by 2060, there'll be at least 2 feet of sea level rise, if not more. At 1 foot of sea level rise, everything in our community changes. The operation at the port changes. All the floodgates to the west of Miami will change and will no longer be able to really operate and do what they're supposed to do because they weren't designed to do that. As we move forward in understanding how to deal with sea level rise, it'd be nice if the governor of the state of Florida actually came to South Florida on king tide season and see what's going on, because without the state's involvement, it's going to be very hard for communities, especially small communities. In Miami-Dade County, we have 34 cities. Maybe 4 cities have some ability to do something: Miami, Coral Gables, City of Miami Beach, and Hialeah. But all the other cities have no funding at all to even staff to understand how to deal with flooding and sea level rise. And sea level rise doesn't affect just the coastal area. West Dade will have significant flooding problems in the future. It will affect banking. We have bankers in the room. You'll probably see in the not too distant future that you can't get a 30-year mortgage in some high-risk areas. You may be able to get a 30-year amortization. You'll be required to have significant excess flood insurance, so it'll make it more costly to own a home or a property. All of these things factor in, and I kind of look at this in a sense that all of these issues, and there's many more, the longer we wait, for every year that we delay, it's like 7 dog years. It's like waiting and not being able to plan. We don't plan to fail, we fail to plan. And we need to start working together as a community to figure out how to adapt and how to make the solutions for the future.
Thank you, Wayne. Round of applause for Wayne. So next, go to Javier Avino, talk to us about workforce housing.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Javier Avino. I'm a land development and government relations partner at the law firm of Bills & Sundberg, and I'm pleased to be here with you all today. I represent primarily developers in a wide range of their acquisition and entitlement and permitting process. And that ranges from the high-end luxury condos that we see in Brickell all the way through to affordable housing. I want to make a distinction between something that Quinn mentioned. He stole a little of my thunder with the affordability, but we'll get into that in a second. There is a difference between affordable housing and workforce housing. So affordable housing is anything 60% and under of AMI. AMI in Miami-Dade County is $48,100 for a single person. So 60% and below is true affordable housing. And affordable housing is really tax credit housing. It's housing that is subsidized by the state, the feds, and to a certain extent, local government. Workforce housing is that gap between market rate housing, if you will, and affordable. So it's 60 to 140%. So to give you an idea, it ranges at 60%, about 28,000, to 140% to just about 67,000, just a little over 67,000. So that's true workforce housing. We have an issue, as Quinn's slide very clearly shows. A lot of people in our community fall in that range. I mean, you've got teachers, nurses, police, firefighters that all are going to fall within that range, especially when they're starting out, and they can't find affordable housing in our community. And that interconnects with everything that's going on here from a transportation standpoint and a sea level standpoint, because everybody wants to be close to the water, it being in Miami, which raises the values. And when the values rise, then you get people having to move further out. And that causes an issue with transportation, because the further you are from the core, from where you're working in downtown, the longer your commute times become. And so it all is interconnected. What's going on now with workforce housing is people are really realizing we've got an issue and we've got a shortage. Some communities have put in voluntary workforce housing ordinances that incentivize or attempt to incentivize developers to actually provide for workforce housing, whether it be in a portion of a market rate development or if it's just a portion of an affordable housing development. But they've really fallen short on some of those programs. They're well-intentioned, but they've really fallen short. Just yesterday, Miami-Dade County at their committee level passed legislation to mandate workforce housing. It's inclusionary zoning ordinance, and it will require that all developments, 20 units or greater, provide 10% of their housing for workforce. And it's a great concept and it's extremely well-intentioned, but that burden on a developer to actually have to provide that workforce housing, and it does have some incentives rolled into it, some density bonuses, et cetera, but it really just mathematically doesn't work. I mean, it's extremely difficult to subsidize those workforce housing units unless you get subsidies from somewhere else. And you know, the government really hasn't come to the table with real solutions for workforce housing. There are some communities, like the city of Miami, that have already passed legislation to waive impact fees. So new developers that do provide for workforce housing wouldn't have to pay impact fees. There are some communities that have toyed with the ideas of reducing parking, increasing density, and increasing floor area to provide for an incentive to developers to actually provide for workforce housing. But it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that our community has to face because we've got some serious issues as we continue to grow and expand. If we don't provide for affordable workforce housing in our community, we're going to lose a portion of our workforce. I mean, they're just not going to be able to afford it. Those numbers that Quinn put up are just not sustainable numbers. I mean, that slide is absolutely correct. We're supposed to be at about a 30% spending towards your rental or your mortgage, and our numbers are just way off. So I think what we need to see and what we have started to see is legislation and programs that hopefully will incentivize developers to actually provide for workforce housing.
Javier. And finally, let's go to John Dohm, who will talk to us about our transportation issues.
I'm John Dohm. I'm the 2015 chairman of the Miami Association. My expertise is, like all of you, most of you anyway, real estate, about 32 years in commercial. My love, though, is the airports, seaports, and the infrastructure. I'm on the master plan committee of Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood. I'm not on the back, huh? Or can they?
Now you were.
Oh, that works? Oh, good. I'm on the master plan committee of Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. I sit on the Freight Transportation Advisory Committee of the Miami-Dade MPO, but I'm here as a private citizen right now. I'll also do some consulting with Florida Department of Transportation, District 6 down here in Miami for the Medley Freight Plan and a number of others. And what I want to talk about is something that's a little different. A lot of folks don't think it's coming at all, but I really personally believe it is, and I think it's something that's really on us much quicker than we're anticipating, in a positive way. It's autonomous vehicles. And I don't know if this is hooked up, but let's give it a try. There we go. In case you're wondering if it's for real, take a look at the screen there. That's just in the last couple of months. Google, everybody, every name you know is up there, and they're spending a lot of money. $500 million to $1 billion each. As you start to look at these things and you think to yourself, okay, so how fast is it going to get here? We've all heard of the Moore's Law concept, which was basically how can you make a faster processing speed through moving from transistors to chips, and then it just gets so fast that you can't do it anymore. But it gives you an example with Moore's Law of doubling, just how quickly things double. The number 2 doubles to 1,000 in 10 doubles, if you think about that. It's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, and you're at 1,024 in 10 shots. When you're a quarter of the way there, it's only 2 doubles, and you're there. So when you start to look at what have we accomplished here, and what happens when you get to a point where you can't squeeze anything more into a small item, like we're realizing with batteries now, when the Samsung battery explodes, it's basically squeezing too much into something small. It becomes an explosive device, but then you could start looking at the thing next to it to help it power. So when we get past the point here where we can't go any faster in a computer chip, we start to to hook that computer into another system, into another computer, into your cell phone. And then you get the combined processing speed of these things. When you look at technology adoption rate, and you see, how this goes, basically how long it took us just to get a telephone going, and then look at how long it took us to get a smartphone going, a couple of years. And for a bigger picture, this is something you could look at on the slide whenever we publish them, but just to give you a perspective, my dad was born in 1892. He lived to be 94. He got to see everything from the electric stove. He came here from Denmark. They had no electricity. He was a blacksmith. And he watched Neil Armstrong walk on the moon and VCRs in 94 years. Look at me. If I make it to 94, I get to see color TV and autonomous vehicles, which I'm talking about now. But I've got an 8-year-old, and we don't know what he'll get to do, but maybe he'll live to be 125. As we look at these connected vehicles, autonomous, it's a slightly different type of a thinking structure, but one leads to another. And I'll go through this very quickly. But basically, autonomous are automated vehicles. They're vehicles that can communicate with one another. They'll communicate with devices, they'll communicate with sensors, just all sorts of different things. And I've actually taken these slides from the Florida Department of Transportation, just so you realize this is not something we're sitting here in the Biltmore Hotel in the morning thinking about a pie in the sky. This is something that our state is very clearly looking at, and as a reality, and a reality much quicker than you think. These are some of the things that the vehicles can do in terms of gathering data, just picking up as you're driving. I know a number of you probably, if you came from Fort Lauderdale or north, you realize there was a power line down on the Palmetto Expressway that literally had routed traffic off of it on the east-west corridor there. The reason you would realize that is, first of all, the overhead signs that told you. Second of all, if you're using Waze or Google Maps, they would have told you. And maybe somebody was good enough to call you and tell you if they thought you weren't using those things. So this is kind of where we are right now. How quickly does it change? Well, we've already got 13 states in the United States that are passing legislation on autonomous vehicles. Florida's one of them, surprisingly, which I'm glad to hear, because they don't seem to get it with climate change with sea level rise and anything else, but at least they get it with this. The federal government just last month passed this, which you can see it's no small matter to look at, but it's basically standards for autonomous vehicles, saying the states can't prohibit them. And this is going to state how they'll move forward. We even have freight, we're looking at the freight transportation committees, et cetera. This is platooning. That's a truck traveling behind another truck at 60 miles an hour, 30 feet behind. You can close the gap. It uses the wind draft to save gas mileage, but also the trucks work together. They work in tandem. You can do 3 of them, you can do 4 of them. They're traveling through Europe already on the roads down in the southwest United States. These are some of the stakeholder working groups that are just working around Florida, university research groups in just Florida. And of course, here is an intersection that's simulated by the Department of Transportation engineers. You can see, they're not running into each other. And the reason, and you'll hear me say this a couple of times today, because everybody says, oh, I don't know if I want to be in the middle of all that. They are all communicating with each other, just like the molecules of your body, and they don't run into each other, and the birds that you see in the sky don't run into each other, and here we go. This gives you some of the ideas of where we go with this. The blue polygons, in case you can't read that, are parking, and how it can change, just the structure of everything from our surface to our streets. My notes didn't show up on this for some reason, but essentially what you've got is 6 lanes there that are shrunk into the size of 4 there. And it includes a much wider area for the pedestrian to walk on for anything else you might want to do, plus a bike lane, which is pretty nifty. If you look at the before and after, there's more planting, there's more a bike lane, there's just a more inviting atmosphere. And of course, where this goes is the one on the left has parking, the one on the right doesn't need it. It's got much less. You look at where you put a building where a parking lot used to be. And as well, that was it. There should have been some more. I don't know, though. I guess they didn't all show up. It gives you an idea, though, of where we are. What we've got here is the ability to put a large amount of people on the road and much fewer cars, and every major company on the face of the earth looking at it already. It's happening all around Europe. The various governments there in Great Britain, in Germany, in France, in Italy are looking at this. The experimental cars are on the road in Germany and France and Netherlands. Singapore already has an entire fleet of taxis that are operational, that are autonomously driven. And it gives you kind of an idea of where we're going. So my hope today is to just get you thinking about this and realizing the implication this will have for real estate. When you don't park the way that we used to park, when you don't have to design your buildings the way we've been designing them, and you'll hear me say again in this presentation, look around you, this building, this is the 90th anniversary, I believe, of the Biltmore Hotel. It was built in 1926, and it's still standing, and it's looking really very good. If you think about the buildings we're building today, what will they look like in 90 years? And how successfully will they serve us? Especially when they're built with an entire parking structure below the building with ramps in it. What do you do with that? You know, we need to start looking at this more carefully in terms of what we're financing, what we're asking our governments to provide, what we're spending our tax dollars for.
Thank you, John. And actually, for my first question, I want to stay with you, John.
Yeah.
You've mentioned some of the implications of autonomous vehicles for real estate. And mostly it seems pretty positive, being able to more intensively use our available land for purposes other than parking. But my question to you then is, will autonomous vehicles create problems for commercial real estate owners and developers? And what will those problems be, and how would they go about addressing them?
I think, in in general, like you said, it's very good for real estate, all told, ultimately. It makes it more walkable as you think about the roads. And even just the last time you went to a mall, if you've gone to one of our mega malls, you realize the Sawgrass Mills, you walk a long way to get just from your car to the mall. When you look at the nice communities like Weston, where you live, Mike, and a lot of the suburbs, we think they're walkable communities, but try to get from one building to another when you have to cross 4 or 5 lanes of traffic, it's a long distance. So I think it's just making the places more walkable and livable. The problems they're going to create for real estate are almost based on that. We've created an entire world for cars. Our real estate regulations, our zoning requires a certain number of parking spaces. Actually, in most suburban locations, it's 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet. We're actually trying to squeeze people down to 125 square feet per employee in the workspaces, et cetera. You can see even the 4 per 1,000 isn't enough if they're all driving their own car. And then, of course, you look at what do you do with all those spaces if they're not driving their own cars. I'm showing you just on some of the slides, and there weren't all of them there, but it's an evolution, but it's an evolution that may happen much faster than you think. The movement from a car that's got assisted driving to a car that drives itself also is a movement from a car that you have to park to a car that you may never have to park. The car that you may never have to park is going to serve multiple people in the room here. Just because we're having a meeting at the Biltmore right now doesn't mean that another 200 people are not having a meeting. They may be in their office, and their car will come and pick us all up and take us where we're going. They'll drop us off and pick up another 200 people. So it starts to make life a little different. I think the biggest problem it creates for real estate is going to be those garages. It's going to be, what are we going to do with these garages with low ceiling heights, with slanted floors, and essentially that are sometimes located in an odd place, like on the bottom of the building? What do you do with a condominium that's got 7 floors of parking? What do we do with even some of the brand new buildings that we're creating, Brickell City Center, with parking under the building, especially when they've tried to maximize that by creating garages that look like an M.C. Escher painting, where you almost can't figure out what's going up, what's going down, and where it goes.
Thank you. So next question's for Wayne. You mentioned that thus far the business community has not been as engaged with the local conversation on sea level rise as is necessary. How can the public sector, academia, and the wider community better engage with the business community, especially the financiers, insurers, and developers, to become more active in finding the shared solutions to the sea level rise challenge?
Well, for most part, stakeholders or developers, when they build or develop, want to make a profit. And if the code or building codes, prohibit them in the future because of the change in the code that puts all the burden on them, they're not going to come here. There's other places to build. Stakeholders need to start working, and government needs to start working together like they do in other parts of the world, like in Amsterdam or Singapore, where the business community, the citizens, and government are engaged to find solutions to flooding and sea level rise. That really hasn't happened here yet. Recently, through the Miami Beach Chamber of Commerce in April, we hosted a stakeholders-only VIP kind of presentation about sea level rise and flooding and the economics of it. We had 125 business leaders from South Florida attend, and we had about 17 different experts that attended from around the country. And we divided the group, after we did a little bit of an introduction, into tables of 12, where we had 2 experts at every table, and the experts rotated about every 15 minutes. And it was very interesting to get the feedback from some of the stakeholders and developers. Many of them, and what I would call the old guard, some of the more established developers have been here in our community, were very receptive, knowledgeable, but didn't want to talk about it and didn't want to ask questions. The younger generation that was there, that represented people like David Martin from Terra Group, were very interested and wanted to respond to a lot of the issues about working with government and working with the community to start developing more solutions and figuring out how to develop a more resilient and sustainable community. But stakeholders also want to know what's at risk And how is it defined or refined in terms of all of the information that's available? Do you plan to build a building for 2 feet of sea level rise or 6 feet of sea level rise? That hasn't been determined. Recently, about 2 weeks ago, I was on a panel at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and they had people from all over the world really discussing this issue. And one of the things I walked away with is that there is so much information being generated, but no one's refining it. No one's making a determination as to how we should plan for the future with the information that's being generated. One of the things that was very interesting and would affect stakeholders and trying to get them involved is that one scientist professor said that the world needs another 17% of land mass to provide for future populations and for growth to provide food. So if you take away deserts and you take away areas where animals cannot graze to provide food, and you take in consideration that coastal areas over the next 100 years will start disappearing because of sea level rise, it starts to make the planet look very small. And stakeholders need to understand those issues, where they build. So tying into flood insurance for stakeholders, flood insurance is designed to do what it shouldn't do. It encourages to build in high-risk areas for low-cost insurance. Stakeholders want to now understand insurance because that's going to stop them from building if insurance skyrockets. But if government works with stakeholders to come up with solutions in zoning and in building codes to build buildings that will be resilient, insurance will stay relatively low or not skyrocket. But the stakeholders need to be engaged also through education. Both FIU, University of Miami, and FAU have programs now. FIU has a Sea Rise Solution Center working with stakeholders and business leaders to try to get them engaged in the process of how they should build in the future. But as I said earlier, almost every building being built in the inner core of Miami is not designed to be sustainable for sea level rise. And that's a real problem. Much of what you see throughout the community, if you see roadway construction, it's not designed to be sustainable for sea level rise. It's usually from a plan that was designed 6 to 8 years ago. Stakeholders need to be engaged in part of that planning process because they need to know if they build a resilient building that the surrounding infrastructure is going to be compatible. And that hasn't happened yet. So by engaging and educating stakeholders, which what we were trying to do through the Chamber of Commerce event, we create more awareness and more involvement. And we were fortunate enough to get quite a few of the stakeholders who want to learn more, be involved. Through the City of Miami Sea Level Rise Committee that I chair, we've invited stakeholders to have roundtable discussions with us about how to work with government. Recently, Mayor Regalado, a few months ago, on his radio show said that talking about sea level rise, that we have to change our zoning. And unfortunately, the burden is going to be put on the developers. And when I met with him a week later, I said to him, Mayor, it would have been better to say that you are going to work with the developers to create a new zoning code and engage them. Because if you make the burden completely on developers, as many of you know, a lot of developers are not stakeholders here in our community. They come here to build and they go elsewhere, or they sell their investment, or they sell the property or development they have. You need to engage them so that when you build or when you design parking garages, one thing that will happen to those parking garages in 100 years, they'll become aquariums, especially those that are built below ground. Part of that problem is that in our current code, the reason that most developers build garages below ground is because it counts towards your FAR and your density and your height in your building. So they don't want it to be above ground because then they lose the ability to make spaces that they can sell or lease out. So they put it below ground, which is a little bit more costly, but it's also bad for the future because those garages will have significant problems in the future from sea level rise. So stakeholders need to be part of the process, they need to be educated, and they need to be engaged by government and the community to build better, but to be incentivized to do that, to build a better community, not just act independently or government act independently without consulting stakeholders to make a better zoning code or a better building code. One last thing I'll just say, many of you probably don't know that Miami-Dade County, for instance, is roughly 40+% on septic tank. And as sea level rises, the first things that will be impacted will be septic tanks and drain fields. And it's estimated that it'll take somewhere between $3 and $8 billion to put in sewer lines in order to take people off septic in the low-lying or the areas that will be most affected over the next 50 to 70 years. Doesn't include the cost of every resident who then has to tap into the line once it passes their home. Those costs usually range anywhere from $10,000 to $25,000 per home or per business. So you can kind of understand, just from that one issue, not even dealing with housing, which, by the way, the White House has a toolkit that they wrote in September that some of you might want to read. It talks about housing and zoning and affordable housing, workforce housing. But when you deal with transportation and you plug in all these things, the numbers start to really add up, and it's quite astronomical.
Next, I'll turn to Javier. When it comes to workforce housing, what has worked in Miami and what has worked in other areas around the country that might provide a good example for us here?
Well, nothing's really worked in Miami because we haven't really engaged in that. I agree with Wayne's earlier statements that we need to really work together with developers and the local governments to come up with legislation that actually works, that will actually incentivize workforce housing. I mean, candidly, we don't have a wide range of true workforce housing in our community. It's as I said, a major issue. I think what has worked in other communities is starting to look at ways of lowering land values, because at the end of the day, as Wayne said earlier, and no developer is going to come in and build something if they're not going to make a profit. And a critical factor to determining their numbers and figuring out whether it works is looking at the value of their land and costs, because the costs are roughly the same for a market rate unit and a workforce housing unit. There's not really much of a difference. But if you can get more density by agreeing to make that unit workforce or offset some of your workforce product by getting a kicker in the market rate units and balance it out that way, then you start having a conversation where you can actually provide for workforce housing that's, for lack of a better word, subsidized by some of that market rate housing. There's also some of the sort of easier discussion items, and we've had a lot of discussions with the development community, especially surrounding this legislation that I mentioned that just passed at committee yesterday. We hosted in our office a couple weeks ago a joint session between the Builders Association of South Florida and the Latin Builders Association, a discussion between the development community and other members of county stakeholders that are pushing this legislation forward, to have a real discussion as to what can work to really incentivize the workforce housing, because mandating it is really just not going to get the job done. People will find ways, and there's a contribution in lieu in the legislation. So some folks may just choose to do that because it's not really workable the way that it is now. The city of Miami actually has proposed some legislation that's scheduled to go to the Planning and Zoning Appeals Board on Wednesday that looks to do some sort of simple baseline stuff. In addition to what they already have, which is waiver of impact fees for workforce housing, it also is going to relax the height restrictions. It's going to relax the parking requirements, allow for up to 50% reduction in parking for workforce housing units. And so it starts to at least allow for some relaxations to incentivize the workforce housing units.
Quinn, can I make a comment? I don't know if my mic is on.
I think they switched it on
Yeah.
and off.
All right, put me back on.
Yeah, turn on Wayne's mic, please.
Okay. Just a comment that maybe you might be familiar with, Javier, but at our Sea Level Rise Committee, one of the things that we've been dealing with is a new term called climate refugees. And the issue really is something that the city and the county have not really dealt with before, and that is that Liberty City and the Overtown area are high ground, meaning that their elevations are higher than other parts of Miami-Dade County. And developers or people who own buildings there are starting to look at that as an investment opportunity for the future. And the problem that it creates is, where do the people who live there, where do they go? And it dovetails into what you're saying about affordable housing and workforce housing. It's going to have a real stress on the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County as developers look for other areas to start developing that don't have risk of flooding.
And one other thing that links into the transportation discussion is we saw the presentation by the MPO of the SMART plan and the corridors that they have planned, and that really connects to the existing Metro Rail corridor. We really have an opportunity there to create real transit-oriented development around those hubs that can bring workforce housing in there and at the same time, with the connectivity from a transportation standpoint, address to a certain extent or alleviate to a certain extent the transportation issue. So we have an opportunity there to work and partner with the county as they further develop the SMART plan to really look carefully at those corridors and determine where appropriate housing can be placed so as to accomplish both of those goals.
Thank you, Javier. So I think we're going to finish up with one final question for John. So we've been talking about how our community of regulators can help facilitate or hinder in terms of sea level rise and in workforce housing. What are urban planners and the regulatory lawmakers doing to facilitate the transformation of our transportation networks using autonomous vehicles or anything else?
And I think first I have to admit that they're part of the problem, not the solution right away. And it's the finance industry and the banking industry. It's the way we've created a system whereby folks will come, one group will come in, design and build it, then they'll stabilize it, then they'll sell it to another group. The people that get caught in the middle are we, the public, and we forget that when we love to talk about the government that we don't like, we are the government. Everybody in here is literally the government. So we need to start looking at this maybe in terms of wearing all the hats at once. The developers will be able to, when they start planning developments, maybe it starts with the urban planners. When we're looking at building 3 more parking garages in the city of Coral Gables, what will those garages be in 30 years? Even the IRS gives you 39 years for a useful life on a building. We know that in 39 years, we're not going to be parking cars on the street or on the surface. We just know the cars won't even look like they do now. We won't travel like we do now. And so I think our government representatives need to look at that. Design the garages so that they have reuse. And when we start to shrink the streets, allow the buildings to change proportionately with that. When we start to remove the parking, just as you said, Wayne, to increase the FAR, increase the height requirements. Everything changes with this. It becomes more opportunities. A typical cloverleaf is a half mile square. I mean, if you look at the Golden Glades interchange, that's a mile square. Just to give you an idea of how big that is, that's 640 acres. When you think about what an acre costs anywhere in Miami, the cheapest acre, not on the Golden Glades, is $1 million. So you got 640 of those, and a lot of developers that could build a lot closer in there if you didn't need it. So I think that it's a very positive possibility. Again, it's things that'll happen in increments, but I encourage everybody in the room to welcome it. Look at what we're creating here, how quickly the evolution of this has taken place. We've gone from backup cameras, from sensors in the cars, to crash protection and all that in really the space of 10 years. When you think about what we'll do in the next 10, it's really quite astronomical.
Great. Well, thank you to John and to Wayne and Javier.
Can I ask a question of John?
Yeah, sure. I love crosstalk.
Sorry, hold your applause. John, I have a question for you. Obviously you have a lot of knowledge about transportation. If you take Miami Beach, your 3 main arteries or portals to Miami Beach are the MacArthur Causeway, the Venetian, and the Julia Tuttle.
Yeah.
All are low-lying.
Yeah.
So if you look out 50 years and we have 2 feet of sea level rise or more,
What are we going to do?
what is the state or the federal government going to do as far as those arteries? If you look this morning because of king tides and you drove from Miami Beach to Miami on the Julia Tuttle, you would see to the right that there were areas in the swales that were already flooded, only about 20 yards or less from the roadway. So 50 years time, or sooner, you could have significant flooding on those arteries. Is there any plan or anything that you know of or how they should plan to basically deal with that?
No, it's almost as though some of the more interesting and innovative ideas that we see come up in the meetings are viaducts, basically elevating the additions to the roadway. Of course, will those viaducts become the main roadway at a certain point? You know, the Gratney Expressway is, the plan is to connect that from where it ends right around 37th, and 119th is the Gratney Expressway, to connect that with I-95, but to elevate it 22 feet in the air. Literally, if you're walking along in the neighborhood, you won't see it. It was one of the big mistakes growing up that was made when I lived here in the 50s, was to build I-95 and create something that really divided the neighborhoods. And it was tragic with the results of it. But so if we could rebuild all of our roads, or when the roads we build in the future are elevated, it starts to take care of part of those problems. And then, of course, you've got some of the great ideas that have been thrown out lately, like the gondolas and the
Water
you know,
taxis.
we've got the vacuum high-speed transit, but no, nobody is really talking at all about what to do with the existing roadway to prevent it from flooding.
That'll give you something to work on.
We're going to give you a break, a 20, 25-minute break,
Thank you
and
very
then
much.
come back here for lunch. So thank you for this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Always a-